And I'm really excited to be speaking about this. I was speaking to Aaron, who's in the room, asking me, do I do this? And yes, I do these types of workshops constantly. I do this advocacy work all the time, but it's really exciting to be talking about it in a business and startup model. It's also really challenging as someone as me who claims and self-proclaims to be anti-capitalist. So this was quite the challenge of talking about a business and a business model and how to be anti-racist, but in an anti-capitalist framework. So lots of unlearning and learning for me, but I also hope that it'll be a really nice learning journey for you folks too. So I do not have a clicker, but I will kind of wave or be like, hey, if you could go to the next slide. So for folks who are watching online, if there's a little delay, it's probably because of that, but also really thankful for folks who are joining online today. Yeah.
Yeah, I can give you a little bit of an idea who's here. Yeah. I'll do a little roll call. Oh, do I have
If
this?
you're online, please wave. Hi, how's it going?
Let me look at the participants list here.
Yeah, hello.
So we have...
Hi,
Inga. We have C. Holmes, we have Chelsea and Steve, we've got Caitlin Charlie, we've got Kirsten Burrows, Rebecca World, and Shelly Taylor.
Oh, hi, Shelly.
We have a few people here who were kind enough to also list their pronouns along with their names.
Great, like it, thank you. Really nice. So most of this workshop will be Yukon focused. I'm actually happy to hear that Shelly is on the call today because I will be using a lot of my experience from Ottawa, from certain places that I've worked in that have had anti-racist frameworks and how they've implemented it. So you folks know that it is possible, but that there are also other models out there that you could use. But first, of course, I want to acknowledge that this workshop is created and facilitated on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin Dun First Nations people and the Tonquachun Council. And I also want to talk about conversations around anti-racism. I will be using words. Sometimes people are like, I can't believe you said white people or white supremacy or dismantle. I am an activist. I've always have been, always will be. So yes, those are languages that I will be using. But also, whenever we're talking about racism, it could be pretty triggering or it could be pretty heavy for people. So please, if you are online or if you're in person and you're like, whew, this is heavy, I need to take a step away, I need to just grab a glass of water or go to the loo, please do take the space and the time that is needed for you to learn. Next one. Yeah, so this is me. A little bit about me. I'm Haitian, I'm an activist, I'm a feminist, I'm bilingual. I'm very involved in political movements. That's pretty much my background. From there, I've moved from the Francophone movement to the student movement to the queer movement to Black liberation and more and more. I'm usually, if folks look for me, I'm usually in a rally or organizing in the back end. And part of that organizing is also with a group that I'm part of called Northern Voices Rising. A lot of people are like, what are you? Are you an employee for them? Are you staff? Are you on the board? We actually just started in June, July, but we are a collective of what I call cutie BIPOCs, that we are recognizing that there's a huge need for us queer, trans, BIPOC folks in terms of either education or advocacy or even events. And so that's our main focus. And so I just wanted to put it out there because I will be talking about grassroots groups and how businesses or startups who are also starting up can support local grassroots groups as well. Excellent. So Rick mentioned if you are online, please do submit your questions. There are no too wild questions. These questions will not be too filtered, unlike other places I've been through. So if you have questions that you think might be contentious, like, hey, how am I a local business and what is this idea called defund the police? Do ask me those questions. And then if you're in person, we will take a 5-minute break after the online portion, and then I'll be able to answer your questions more in depth. But just giving that opportunity for folks who are online to be asking their questions. And if there are questions in French, please do ask them as well. All right, so just gonna move here. So whenever people ask me, how do I implement what is anti-racism? I always say, well, there are kind of, I don't want to say steps. I don't want to use that ableist term, but there are kind of ways that you can do it. And there's no linear way of addressing racism or being anti-racist. And so I thought in terms of when we're talking about small businesses, whether it's a small business or you yourself as an entrepreneur, we're going to take it a little bit slower. I know it's a 2-part workshop. And so what I thought we could do is we'll start with you because it starts with you, right? It starts with you recognizing your own biases. It starts with you learning new concepts, new words, but also unlearning. We live in a society that has been molded to not address racism. We live in a society based on racist practice. And so to be anti-racist, there has to be a lot of unlearning, which means you have to be involved. And it also means you have to be willing to give up some power. And that's kind of hard when you're an entrepreneur, right? You're like, but I kind of need that power. I kind of need that control. But we'll go into more in depth into what does that look like. And then I thought we can go into concepts to action. So whenever I do presentations, I like to do it more action focused. There's a reason why I'm not an academic. I cannot do theory all day, every day. And so if you're like me, you're like, this is all nice and dandy, but how do I get this moving? How do I do this? So yes, we're gonna talk about words, but also what do they mean? And examples and ways these words, which you'll see in the next slide, examples and ways they manifest, and then concrete ways to dismantle whichever program they're trying to uplift. And then this workshop over today will be mostly in terms of, or I'll be tackling mostly internal practice. So addressing your HR, your internal policies, your work culture, and calls to action. And I do recognize small businesses and someone who is solo might not be into a HR or internal policy. And so I will talk about those frameworks as in both ways. So either as you, your business yourself, or you, your business, and the staff, whether that staff is 1 or 2 or 10, however small business you see. And then next week, which I hope you will join, we'll go more into external practices. So the marketing and communications, and how is that, or how can that be anti-racist? Your client or your customer engagement, as well as social innovation. I know everyone's talking about this nice term of social innovation. Yes, it's tech, yes, it's VR, yes, it's all this stuff, but we can also address the fact that some of them do have racist practices as well. So yeah, the famous words. I like to talk about these words because, again, I'll be using them, but also if you're thinking of an anti-racist framework, you have to know what they mean, right? So we talk about racism, and I think now that we're in 2020, we're no longer in that time to go on Wikipedia and just talk about racism. We need to address anti-Black racism. We need to address anti-Indigenous racism. We need to address anti-POC racism. And so what does that mean? Anti-Black racism can look like various things. It can look like language, right? When you walk around somewhere and somebody's using language like that was lit, that was this, that was that, and you're like, where does this cool language comes from? Well, if you're using that language and you're not supporting Black people, that is a form of anti-Black racism. Those are things that you have to think about when you're doing your business, when you're doing your marketing and your communications. If you are using language that is by Black culture, but you are not supporting Black culture, you are profiting from Black bodies, and that's racist. Anti-Indigenous racism is the same thing. We're in October, and we know that Halloween is coming up. And even as a Black person, Halloween is that one time where, I mean, every day is a day, but that one day where you're like, oh my gosh, everyone's happy about it. I have so many anxieties. Why? Because people make costumes. We hear about it all the time, right? Costumes about Pocahontas, the famous Pocahontas costumes, the famous Black costumes with blackface. We could even ask our Prime Minister about that. What does that mean when you have a business that incorporates these ideas, but that, again, doesn't necessarily see the impacts that they have, go back, the impacts that they have on the people themselves and the history behind it. It also manifests in healthcare and childcare. I'm sure most of you are wearing orange today, and can already know, but you need to think about it when you have a business and you're thinking of who am I catering to, especially here in the territory. We always talk about the acknowledgement. Oh, it's great. We're going to acknowledge the Yukon First Nations. Great, you acknowledge them, but do you actually include them in your plans? And if you do include them, how do you include them? And then I put the unjust systems, I put it there for anti-Black racism as well as anti-Indigenous racism. And the unjust system, mostly talking about what is called the justice system, because those justice systems are most definitely unjust to certain populations. And we need to address that, especially when you're looking at businesses. Sometimes we think, oh, a business cannot be too political, but whenever you're dealing with people and identities in itself are political. And so you need to think about your partnerships. You need to think about what consequences either your decisions can make that may support an unjust system. I put anti-POC racism there because that's one that we're not really talking about right now. Black Lives Matter is a huge movement. At a time there was I Don't Know More, that was a big movement. And those are what a lot of us activists call flavor of the months. But we need to be ahead of that curve. We need to be ahead of the flavor of the months. Anti-POC, I'm talking about people of color or racialized people. And we can talk about brown people and how not all brown people are Muslim, but many brown people are affected by Islamophobia. And so in your business, let's say you have a catering business or food business, how do you cater to brown people? How do you cater to specific needs? COVID-19 is another one. Even here in the territory, we could talk about the anti-Asian sentiments that have been happening and those impacts on either Asian entrepreneurs in town. And then immigration and refugee, and I'll talk more about how that affects people that are, I say immigration, technically, if we're not First Nation of the land in which we are on, we are all immigrants. But here I'm specifically talking about migration and refugee and folks that are coming here on statuses and how they either try to support your business or they will be your employees directly. We have to talk about white supremacy. I've been in so many workshops and they're like, we can't talk about that, that's horrible. And it's like, well, if you're going to be anti-racist, you need to know what you're combating, right? You need to know that white supremacy is that root. I don't know if you're like me, if you have a bajillion plants in your home, but when you see one plant dying, you're like, oh, I'm gonna check the root system, right? White supremacy is that root system in which we understand everything. And so if you're gonna be anti-racist and you're starting a business, you need to understand that the concept of business is from white supremacy. It does come from what we call capitalism. And capitalism is a tool of white supremacy because it was used to gain capital over certain groups of people. I am Haitian. I will never let you forget that. But I do like to talk about the fact that we are we are mostly the children of the Black Revolution and liberation when we're talking about slavery. And slavery is one of those tools that was used for capitalist gains, which was tools for businesses. We have to understand that concept when we're talking about money. Culture, of course, it's in sports, it's in the work, it's, you know, we talk about colonization and history. Again, these might sound like really political words, but when we're addressing anti-racism, we need to understand those concepts. And so we're moving into anti-racist. Being anti-racist, what does that look like? It looks like groups, it looks like activism, it looks like academia, it looks like education, it looks like policies, it looks like a webinar like this, it looks like dismantling oppressive systems, and it looks like dedicated spaces. And when I mean dedicated spaces, I mean if you are a startup, and you're saying my startup is specifically for a type of people or an identity of people, those are dedicated spaces because you're recognizing that not everything is catered to people, right? And then my favorite, the cutie BIPOC. I love the way it sounds because, you know, we cutie BIPOCs are cute. But here I'm specifically talking about queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color, you know, and we have to address intersectionalities. There is a mistake, I'm so sorry. But in intersectionalities, I mean, you know, you can be Black and Indigenous. You can be Black and queer. You can be Black, queer, and disabled or differently abled. And so again, when you're thinking of your business, you're thinking of your startup, think about these identities and not just one. Hey, I'm gonna cater to Black people only because Paige told me so, without thinking about the queer or the Black trans people. Next, yeah. Okay, so human resources is my favorite. And again, I do recognize that some people, for your startup, you might be just one person. For now, I'll base it more on the smaller businesses. And so often I see small businesses say, you know what, we do not have to do all the things that big businesses do because we don't have time for it or we don't have the resource for it. And unfortunately, people tackle it on only when they're being called out or only when they have a huge lawsuit against them. And by then it's too late. So if you are a startup, if you're a small business, if you are thinking of expanding into whether it's one staff person or 3 or 10, it's best to have those hiring practices in mind or that human resources in mind ahead of the game again, because then you don't have to worry about it and play catch up. In terms of what, human resources in an anti-racist framework, I think we need to address the current, the current situation. So we talk a lot about diversity in hiring. I say diversity in hiring or lack thereof. You know, just recently in the territory, Yukon government announced that they were doing specific targeting hiring. And I invite you to check out those CBC comments. I always say check those comments out because especially in the territory where we're so small, we know who those people are, and chances are you will interact with them as entrepreneurs or small business owners. If you're looking at your space and you just have white people, well, you are going to create white business. It's very obvious. I don't have to go into details for that. But you do need to think again about intersectionalities. Who are you catering to? It's pretty much any business model is like the who, what, where. But when you go into that who, let's say you're doing a summer student camp, you know, you're saying, well, okay, we're targeting specific age groups. How are you targeting the specific age groups that aren't represented or aren't thought about? Pay and salary, we hear it a lot about pay equity. And often people say, well, it's nice to have pay equity, but I'm just starting. I can't afford to do pay equity. And we'll go into the next slide, not yet, but I will show you examples in way you can actually have pay equity. In Canada, we talk a lot about the disparity and that gender binary. So we talk about men versus women, but less often do we talk about that disparity with, again, racialized men and women, racialized and variously abled men and women and that pay equity. And so those are, again, ways. It's ways that you're dismantling those systems that are there, that are making you not think things through, or not think about the marginalized voices that are not represented. And then work status. So right now, if I say, I'm a staff or I'm an employee who's on full-time, part-time contract, most people know what that means, right? It means full-time, most of the times it means you're salaried, or, you have over 35 hours. Part-time, it means you're hustling like no other. You could be like me, where you're full-time and part-time, or you could be full-time, part-time and contract. But sometimes we need to think about people who are on permits. And I'm specifically talking about small businesses, because that's a way that, yes, you can get people to come in your business, to have that human resource, but without necessarily doing that legwork of how do you find people to come and be your staff. And then, of course, hiring committees. Now, small businesses, sometimes that hiring committee is just you. But I will challenge you on that and think of, what can a hiring committee look like for a small business? Okay, now. Next slide. Yeah. So in terms of hiring practices, do have designated groups for hiring. And what I mean by that is, do look for the racialized workers, the indigenous workers. Be specific. I mentioned that YG Yukon government initiative, and how people are saying, well, you can't do that. That's reverse racism. Do watch those comments, because you'll notice a lot of people that are claiming reverse racism are usually people who have the power in the first place, are usually white people. Designated groups for hiring is not meant to be a specific place to reverse racism. Reverse racism, sorry to tell you, it doesn't exist, but it's rather saying, hey, we have a need for specific people, because we are recognizing that these specific people do not have the same opportunities, or not always encouraged to have the same opportunities, or not thought of, or the space that we have created are not created for them and their intentions. And so we're coming in to switch that. If it's your own business and you have designated groups for hiring, it says a lot to the people who are from that demographic. If you're saying, hey, we need facilitators for a workshop, and we're specifically looking for Yukon First Nations, well, we know that in principle, I hope, and in practice, that you support Yukon First Nations. And I know that there are not ways that I'm gonna have to navigate certain conversations, because you are specifically looking for specific targets. Diversify your hiring committee. I always say, if you are the person and you are white, and you're looking for a designated group for hiring, you might not know what are the specific needs of those folks, right? There's nothing wrong with being a small business and asking other people to come and join you. There's absolutely nothing wrong. And I'm sure as entrepreneurs, you know that, you know the hustle, you know that it's by working together that you can get things through. So do have a hiring committee. And if it's your friends, or if it's colleagues, or if it's people from other businesses, especially smaller entrepreneurs that you've seen grow, ask them how they've grown, and ask them to be on your hiring committee. And my favorite is hire staff who are anti-racist. I can't talk about this enough, because often people say, yeah, we've hired the diversity, but if the diversity, and again, your goal, I'm assuming you're here to talk about your business being anti-racist. So if your goal is to be anti-racist, but you hire people who are racist, you have a problem. You're never gonna actually be anti-racist. So how do you do that? Well, ask the questions. When you're asking them, why do you wanna join my business? Ask them, how do you see my business being anti-racist? Flat out. Ask them, how do you combat racism on your own time? Be specific, because again, A, it makes that person question. B, you get to know that person where you're at and where you're coming from. And if they're saying, you know what, those are questions I can't answer, it's not going to be a good fit. And it means that you will avoid that clash that will probably come with all of the words that I've talked about before. So pay and salary, yes, if you are alone and you're just, let's say you're a local thrift shop, and you're like, I just started, it cost me so much money just to get this building. And I'm lucky, which is a lot of the language people will use, is I'm lucky to find the one staff that could commit to me. That's great. Find ways to pay your staff a decent and living wage. So here in Yukon Territory, decent living wage means $18 an hour. In some places, in Ontario, for example, you'll see a call for $15. I can't stress that enough, because if you pay them a decent and living wage, chances are they're going to stay. And that's really hard when you're finding, especially now, we call it the gig economy. Everybody's got 15 different gigs and it's amazing, but we don't have this loyalty program that maybe people that are my parents' age or my group parents' age, whichever, have had before. If it doesn't work for us, we're moving on. Right? Same thing with entrepreneurs. You probably went in a job, it wasn't working for you, and you're like, I am not going to go do this 9 to 4. I'm going to do my own thing, or 9 to 5. I'm going to do my own thing. So find ways to pay your staff a decent living wage. Obviously, when you do that, you close the gender wage gaps. And if you're not able to do that, right? If you're like, hey, I don't have the money, I don't have the budget, offer incentives of value. And by incentives of value, I don't mean pizza parties. Please stop with your pizza parties. Pizza parties does not pay gas in the car. Pizza parties don't do anything. Most people are keto, so you're probably wasting that $30 anyways. But do find, if you're able to find benefits, I know, for example, the Chamber of Commerce here offers plans that are pretty well, that the rate is pretty well for small businesses. Join a Chamber of Commerce, which is kind of a weird thing for me to say, but join a Chamber of Commerce to be able to offer benefits for your staff. Pension is a really big one. You'll notice that a lot of people will go to government, myself included, because you want a pension. But think about it in a way that, yes, it means that you as a business will have to pay some of those fees, but at the same time, you are telling your staff, I'm investing in you. I'm giving you something more because I know you are here, you're committed to do the work, but I see your value and I see your future as well. Union, obviously I would not be a labor activist without telling you to get your staff to join a union. Often people think unions are for those big places, big workspaces. There are unions that do take small workspaces. And with a union, your staff can find those benefits and those pensions. And you don't have to do all that legwork in finding which benefit program is actually good when the union does all the work. Personal days and flexibility, I'm going to tie those in because especially if you're not a service provider, right? So I talked about the small thrift shop, but if you are someone who is a consultant and you have people that are working for you as assistants, do they really need to be there 8 to 4 or 9 to 5? Right? Can they have a personal day? Can they, let's say they were writing a grant proposal up until 10 p.m. Can they have a day after to be like, I do not want to look at words right now because I am tapped out. Same thing with flexibility. Can they not work, especially in a COVID time, right? We're talking about flexibility and working at home. Does that time that you put for your workers, does it apply in a COVID, in a COVID mind frame? And my favorite, because everyone's like, again, pay salary, how do we get that? I come from the NGO sector and I could tell you NGOs got money. So collaborate with an NGO, right? If you are able to, let's say, have a summer student, just so you know, there are so many grants out there for people that are either returning to university or want to come to the territory. Obviously not now, we're in a COVID situation, but there are ways that you can collaborate with a local NGO. And sometimes people don't think outside the box. They think, you know what, my business is consulting an NGO, and that's all I'm going to do is consult and tell them what to do, and they're going to put it into action. Well, if you're able to find somebody who wants to learn and to be a student, and you're not taking over all that burden, talk to an NGO, whether it's the NGO that's hiring you for that consultant fee, and say, hey, in that budget that we're applying for, can we apply for a student or an assistant with a decent wage? And we can get them to pay, they get to learn, and we get to do the work. Work status, oh my gosh. You know, I could talk about the situation here in the territory. Another work that I do is I work for the Yukon Federation of Labor. And so we obviously hear about what's happening with people who get work permits. And, you know, we have to talk about the fact that often people will abuse or take their staff for granted in terms of their status. Work permits usually are people who are either looking for residency in Canada or to become citizens. And so they will apply through the work program through the government, but there are incentives that allows for businesses to also hire people on permit status. Again, if you are hiring somebody who comes from out of country, don't be an abuser, right? Usually they are racialized staff, they are racialized people, and chances are they are the people that are being paid under minimum wage sometimes. And so again, with the paying your staff a decent and living wage, that also applies to people who aren't necessarily have status in the country. But do create sustainable jobs with flexibility. And what I mean by that is if you have somebody who is coming from another country, let's say they're on a permit, usually those permits have expiry dates. And so do create a job where somebody else can take the work and continue as opposed to starting all over. So employee policies. So again, I'm mostly focusing folks who have that startup that are thinking about having employees. So employee policy, do you have one? Yes, and why not if you don't have one? What's in its intentions? A lot of times I've been to so many jobs, but I see an employee policy and I'm like, what is this for? You know, you're not even telling me what I can do as an employee. You don't even follow the Canadian labor laws. You know, what is this paper for? So make sure that if you do have an employee policy that it follows the Canadian labor laws, even if you are a small business and even if you are an entrepreneur who has one employee, because chances are if you don't follow it and that one employee makes a complaint to you, you're actually wasting your time and your money fixing that issue as opposed to working with that staff and getting the work you were meant to do happen. Same thing if you have staff, let's say your work or your business is more seasonal, right? So in the summer or it's in the winter, you have your contracted staff only for a time. Your employee policies can look like, this is what we are. This is our limitations. This is who we are as a business, and you need to follow that. Accountability and recourse, a lot of people don't think about that, or they think about it in a cute way, like, oh yeah, of course we don't discriminate and we don't harass. Of course we don't do sexual harassment and workplace violence. But those are things that do happen within a workplace, whether you think about it, whether you do it consciously or unconsciously. So when you do have your employee policy, make sure that you have a discrimination and harassment policy, again, instead of waiting for something to happen. And in this context, because we're talking about anti-racism, I could tell you right now, most discrimination and harassment policies are weak. They are weak sauce. Whatever. They're not good because they don't address what racism is, what systemic racism is, what anti-Black racism is, what anti-Indigenous racism is. And so when you have someone who is like me, comes into your work, says, I want to work, I recognize that I'm facing anti-Blackness, and I don't have the language or the verbiage to talk about it, you're going to have people who quit. And again, you're not creating a sustainable workforce for your business. And especially if you're a small business, people talk, and especially Black people, we like to talk. So we will tell our friends, this place is anti-Black, don't even worry about going there. Don't even, as much as the work looks great or the business looks empowering, don't even bother because they're not here for us. And that actually, unfortunately for you, means that your business is probably going to tank. sexual and workplace violence. A lot of my work is done in anti-oppressive frameworks, which means I think about not only the diversity of people, but the diversity of issues that can come up. And again, better to be ahead of any issue that can happen instead of something bad happening, especially if you're just starting and you get your staff and then you have a complaint about sexual harassment in the workspace. You're, again, taking your time and your energy dealing with that as opposed to what the intentions of your startup or of your business was. Internal policies, I think, you know, whenever people talk to me about their internal policies, for me, when I read it, I look at it as, oh, this is going to tell me who you are, and beyond, you know. So one of the things I like to think of as internal policies, and sometimes they can be public or sometimes they could be hidden, but me as a racialized person, why should I support you? If you're a soap maker, why should I support you other than the fact that I need to shower and smell good? You know, what are those reasons that will say, yes, I'm going to support you because you support my people, because you support my vision, because you support my existence. And then relevancy and time. You know, if you have these policies, sometimes it could just be on Facebook, right? Like, we are soap makers, but we are anti-racist, you know, anti-homophobic, la, la, la. But is it updated annually? Is it because that's what's happening right now? And you're just like, well, you know, we're talking about Black Lives Matter. I want to get business from people who support Black Lives Matter without actually supporting the movement. Or are they addressing current issues? Yeah. So employee policy, pretty simple. Have one. Make sure that it's created by employees and for employees. And especially if you're just starting, what an awesome time to talk to your newest staff and say, hey, I'm just starting. My plan is to expand to 5 people again. You know, how can I make this a better workspace? I obviously have made some mistakes or there's potential for mistakes. How do I not do that? And especially your racialized staff. Often we are consulted only when something happens, as opposed to making sure that the workspace itself has us as an intention of inclusion. Don't know where to start? Call a union. Pretty simple. If you check out a union's website, usually there's collective agreements. Honestly, if you have to copy paste it, and then you'll have the verbiage and you'll be able to tailor it down. But it does mean that for a staff who sees that coming in and sees that you are ready to host them, if I could use that word, it means that, okay, you have your things together. I want to work with you because I understand that you understand my value. You understand what I'm going to be doing in your workspace, and I'm going to put some effort into working and collaborating with you. Accountability and recourse is a big one, especially for either small or even big businesses, really. There's very rarely anything about accountability. So obviously people try to address situations when they occur. And I think I've spent a lot of time talking to folks about before they occur. But accountability goes both ways. And how amazing would it be if, just think about you going into a workplace and you see that if you don't come in on time, you might lose your job. But if my boss does a certain thing, then they have to be accountable to me, and they have to be accountable to the customers and clients. So think about accountability in both ways, and include anti-racist resources. So mental health support networks. I talked about local NGOs, the human rights commissions, and I put an X on police. So let's think about it for a second, where your business is about, I don't know, creating safe space and events for LGBTQ, 2S people. Well, if something were to happen in those events, what's your first recourse, right? And this is something that's internal. You're not necessarily going to tell everybody who's coming in, like, hey, welcome to this dance party. So just so you know, we got mental health services. All like you could, that might put a different twist on the dance party. But internally, be ready to address those situations. And so let's say, again, you have an event, you know that there are recourses, you know that there's the Canadian Mental Health Association. Call them and say, hey, can you folks be on location? We're a small business or we're just starting, so we don't necessarily have all the resources, but can you pay your staff to come to our events? Or if you're thinking of, I'm thinking of Victoria Faulkner, right? Can you folks come and give a presentation to the people who are going to be bouncers as to different gender identities in terms of the washrooms and washroom security? Don't call the cops. You know, I don't call the cops because most of the times they actually escalate the situation. Some people will say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, think about it. If you had a family party and somebody showed up with a gun, you will most likely not feel comfortable. For racialized people, we know and we see it, and I'm sure you see it in the news, that a lot of the times police are not meant to secure our space or to provide resources or support. And so it already heightens up our idea and concept of security. And so if I know that a local business or has an event and that cops are going to be there, I'm not going to go because I know that me and my people are not wanted or not welcome. And that's, I mean, I don't want to say it's okay because it's not, it's very unfortunate, but that means that I will not support that local person because I know I'm not invited, I'm not included. And so be ready to learn and unlearn. I know I kind of glazed over it really quickly, but these are things that you can check out online, right? If you can Google how many COVID cases has happened in Ontario, 700, you could Google, you know, what are other resources and local organizations that can support the work that I'm trying to do. Internal policies should always have an anti-racist framework. Please don't have it just because of this one webinar. As much as I'd love to think I have that power over people, I know I don't. Do it with intention and do it not just for a certain group of people, but all people, including anti-oppressive frameworks as well. And then relevancy and time is a big one. Engage all members of your business. So if your business has a board of directors, if your business have certain leadership, if your business have people on the front line, include every single person regardless of their status, because again, that means you're creating that culture with your business. It also means the person who's doing your finances, right? If you have to do an anti-racist framework for that person who's doing your finances, do it. So you know that you're not dealing with someone who will want to divert money somewhere where it won't necessarily be useful. And we'll talk about money in a second. And be with the times, please do. Language, culture, social context. Next week, I will use local examples of businesses that have been racist and businesses that are anti-racist. And so I do encourage you to come next week, but we'll look at how the language that is used can create a whole whack of nonsense or a whole whack of support. And what does that mean when you live in a place that right now, especially now, we are so emboldened to shop local, to support local. And so if you're using certain language, if you are catering to certain culture, what does that mean to you as a business? Yeah. Work culture is probably one of my favorites because whether I'm working with a consultant, whether I'm working at a location, I like to ask people, and especially the employees, what is it like to work with that person? Is that person great? Sure. Is that person nice? Okay. Does that person fully understand social context? And what do your employees small p and big P, so past and present, say about working for you and with you? Who does your business cater to? Is your business sustainable and viable? Those are really important questions. I'll use an example. Like I said, I'm so happy Shelly's on this call. I used to work in Ottawa at a place called Venus Envy. Venus Envy is a sex and bookstore, and I knew that that place was queer friendly. And when I first started working, I had just opened up my queerness. I was like, oh my God, this is me. But I knew that I wanted to work there because Venus Envy not only was a space created by queer people for queer people, but also addressed the needs of racialized people through the books, through the sex toys, believe it or not, through lube, but also understood that queer people come in different shapes and size and colors. And that for me meant, okay, I want to go there. I want to support them. I know that they have a bursary fund for racialized people and sex workers. I want to go there. And so not only did I shop there for various reasons, but I also wanted to work there. And I asked the staff, what's it like to work there? That work was actually part-time. I was doing sales. I am horrible with sales because I have to be there a certain time to open the store. But at the same time, when I knew that people loved their workplace, I was encouraged to find other side hustles to support that business and that business owner because it was local and supported local communities. And I did everything that I could to be within that space. I also knew that if I was going to work there, there were certain things that were acceptable and certain that wasn't. I knew that it was a safe space for me as a newly out queer person well, I'm not of color, a Black person, because I knew that there were conversations that could happen. And I knew that there were events that were created for me. So, you know, think about your employees. What would they say about you? Same thing if you're a consultant. What would people say about you? How do you go above and beyond? So Yukoners, we have so many consultants in town. All are very amazing. Why would I go for a specific one that is going to understand my bigger picture and my bigger vision, as opposed to another one who is most likely just going to take my money and go and probably will deliver something, but it's not necessarily going to go into a further strategic visioning. Celebration and commemorations, and those are, yes, of course, I'm thinking of days off, right? Do you offer that to people? Do you take a day off? But I'm also thinking of which days do you commemorate? And so if you're thinking of being anti-racist, I think any business will say, well, the best times to get money is when we talk about Black Friday, or we talk about Christmas, or we talk about Canada Day. Canada Day is probably my favorite when I'm looking at businesses, because that's where I'm like, aha, you're just here to take my money. You're not actually anti-racist. If you are supporting Canada Day and you say you're supporting Yukon First Nations, but you can't realize that some people, that day has a lot of history and is very triggering, excuse me, you are not thinking about the anti-racist impact that your business can have. Same thing with fairs and conventions. Which ones are you participating in? Who is founding them? You know, are you able to talk about anti-racism, or are they white spaces? Do you go to fairs and conventions that are done by racialized people or that are catered to racialized people? I'm thinking here in Yukon, everybody goes to the Cranberry Fair. It's a thing, right? Like if you don't go to the Cranberry Fair and you're selling pottery, you're not gonna sell pottery. It's a thing. But do you actually go to the Yukon African Music Fest? And if not, why? Right? Sometimes it is that it's like, you know what, that's not my position, or that's not my space to be in, and that is fair. And that's also part of celebrations and commemorations. Sometimes as a business owner or startup, it's also recognizing, or even a consultant, it's recognizing, am I the right person to do this work? Or can I empower somebody else who's racialized to also do the work, either with me or to do the work, period. Budget is my kind of favorite, because you know, in a business mind frame, again, as an anti-capitalist, you have to think about money. But I like to say, where does that money go? And when I'm looking at your budget, if you don't have a budget, please do have a budget. But if you're creating a budget, does your budget reflect your internal policies? So going back to the work culture, if you're wondering, oh my gosh, how do I create an anti-racist work culture? Ask your staff. And if your staff are all white, obviously you did not listen to the first 3 or 4 spots of the presentation, but maybe that's something you should see. Take a picture of your staff. Take a picture of your staff in the last 5 years and the last 10 years and ask them. Create space and ability for change. That's a really big one, especially when you're starting. You're like, I don't want to create change, right? You're just starting, you want to test it out. What better way than to test out something that hasn't been done before? And that you can Google it. Mandatory trainings, but also incentives for personal growth. You see that in mostly either government or more established, I'm putting that in quotations, not to say that small businesses aren't established, but bigger, bigger budget, bigger funding, where they'll talk more about mandatory trainings, but you can do that in a small business mind frame as well. You can bring in people, again, consultants or other local NGOs and say, can we partner? Because right now we need to talk about anti-racism. We have client services. We need to talk about it with our staff. Remember I said local NGOs, Yukon, we have so many NGOs. That should mean so much money and potential. So not only are you supporting the local NGOs, but you're creating that partnership for that NGO to also talk with you. So I'm thinking of, a local NGO who often will have money to have guest speakers or events. Maybe see if those guest speakers and events can be anti-oppression trainers, and they can come within your workspace. And maybe say, if you don't have the resources, you could be like, well, I'm a soap maker. You will most likely need to thank that guest speaker after paying them. Can we do an exchange? Or can I come in? I'm a baker. I make lots of delicious bread. Can I use one day at the farmer's market to sell the breads and then, come in and support your NGO? Another idea I'm thinking of that happens every year. I want to talk about Molotov tattoo. I'm sure most people here know who Molotov is, and how they support local NGOs. So one day a year, they'll have flash tattoos, and they'll say any money that we raised will go to Victoria Faulkner or an initiative brought to you by Victoria Faulkner. Those are ways that I'm thinking, oh, if you're able to support Victoria Faulkner, I'm talking about Victoria Faulkner a lot today, but if you're able to support them, and they have certain standards in terms of who their clientele is, I'm going to support you as a business owner, because I know that, okay, you are pro women and you're pro trans people. Like, I'm going to go and I'm going to get my tattoo done. Create and maintain an anti-racist and anti-oppressive work culture. Of course, I wrote create, because I can't talk about it enough. But maintaining is the harder part. Once you've done that mandatory training, does it just go past that mandatory training, or does it go beyond? Do you talk about it every time? Does everything you do within your business have that little page in the back of your mind of like, oh, is this anti-racist? Oh, is that anti-oppressive? Think about it that way, because then chances are you will always be challenging yourself in the decisions you make, and it will be tiring and it will be exhausting, and you will probably really enjoy those days off, but it'll mean that you're doing whatever you're doing with intention, and you're probably doing it right. And if you don't do it right, fix it to do it right. Celebrations and commemorations, yes, Christmas is a good time, but join celebrations and calls to action that are anti-racist. If you are a soap maker, and like today is Orange Shirt Day, can you not make orange soaps? And then whatever money you get goes to a certain Indigenous group, you know, find ways that are celebrations that are not often thought of, but that are anti-racist, because most of the times those are the ones that are commemorated by NGOs, not necessarily businesses. But when you see businesses, you're like, okay, cool. Again, I'm gonna have that incentive to support you. Support and collaborate local, for sure. You know, if you are in the food industry and you see somebody who is I keep pointing at you, but a kids camp or summer camp, you know, find ways to support each other and say, hey, we are both anti-racist. Why can't we create a network and go from there? You know, why can't we be that group that's going to show people how to do things, how to collaborate, how to be socially innovative? And in next week, I'm actually going to bring in examples of local businesses that have come together in an anti-racist combative framework. Be ready to learn and unlearn. I can't say that enough. But your budgets. A lot of people say, how do I make my budget anti-racist? Sometimes I say, you know, do you have a solidarity line in your budget? You know your revenues, you know that people are going to buy certain things, but from whatever revenue you do you have a line, whether it's like $5 or $100 or $5,000, where you're like, cool, whatever local organization like Northern Voices Rising or, you know, any other ones, you know, the Youth for Climate Justice, can I not support them by giving them $200 or $5,000 for them to do the work that needs to be done? And sometimes you can't. Like, I know that that's something, you know, if you, that's a reality for some folks, especially now in this COVID time where people might be struggling. Budget and money is not always a way that you can support people. You can utilize your resources, whether they're human resource, whether they're financial, your social networks, your physical space. An example, I mean, I'm using Molotov again, but I do want to talk about Dan Bushnell, who is a tattoo artist, who saw the rally in Whitehorse, the Black Lives Matter rally at Whitehorse, and said, hey, I could do graphic designing and I will do posters for you. And that's what I could do right now. That's what I could commit, and I will pay for those posters. And you can put them in town, you can put your message, but I'm here for you. And then moved on to do banners. Right? Those are ways, again, that I'm like, hey, that's a local business that has my back, that is doing the work that is not necessarily the flashy and look at me work, but that will support local grassroots organizations or people to feel better in the space that wasn't created for them to feel better in. Oh, thanks. Yeah. Calls to actions happen all the time. I'm wearing an orange shirt. It's a call to action. There's different ways that they come through. Sometimes you'll see list of demands. You know, we demand for that statue to be gone. Sometimes you'll see programs. So here's a 10-point program of how this institution or this place cannot be racist. Sometimes they are local. Sometimes they are global, you know, sometimes they're very, well, I mean, most of them are political, but they are either political in nature, and I mean political with against governments directly, or the social climate that is happening. So, you know, BLM, land back, climate justice, pro-Palestine, divest, like, you know, families of sisters in spirit, trans people's rights, and more and more. There's always solidarity actions that are going to happen. And so if you're thinking about being anti-racist and you're thinking, well, one day I won't have anything to do, surprise, you will always have something to do. You will always have a call to action to be anti-racist. And so the question is not, do you see it or do you hear it? But the question is whether or not you will take the necessary steps to look out for the ones that aren't necessarily talked about. I'm thinking of a divest campaign, for example. Lots of campaigns out there on divest of fossil fuels. You know, if you or divest in certain places that do t-shirts in Haiti because they use children. You know, if you need t-shirts for a certain event, are you going to support Gildan? right? Or are you going to find somebody who's local and who's racialized that can do the t-shirts in a way that's more sustainable and equitable? What happens if you're called out or called in, you know? Sometimes those call outs, and again, I'll use examples next week, but sometimes they can perpetuate scandals or conversations, whether those conversations be public, and public I mean in the media, or I mean on Facebook, on social media, or private. Sometimes it could be, you know, just a staff or a client, or sometimes you'll get an email that's like, I cannot be in this space anymore because certain things happen. Those are things that I'm going to go into next week. You see what I did there? Kind of planted the seed for you to come back. But they do happen, especially when you try to be anti-racist. And so an example that I can give is somebody will put out, as a business, they'll put out a statement that says, we are anti-racist. And people will be like, what are you talking about? I'm looking at your website, it's all white people. Whenever you had racialized people, you treated them bad. You don't do anything beyond this statement. So again, if your intention is to be anti-racist and the work you do is anti-racist, chances are you might not get called out, right? If you include the people as well. But when it does happen, there are ways that you can respond to it that is actually going to do the legwork, as opposed to just being symbolic. And next. Yeah, so next week we'll talk about it. So we'll talk about, you know, when you are called out, some places will ask for a PR firm or a PR friend on how do I come back to this mistake that I've made, but not just about the call outs, because I don't want to make it too negative, but also your marketing and communications. So when you're putting out posters or promotions out there, who is on those posters? Which hands are you using? Which photoshopped person are you using? And vice versa. If you're always using racialized people, but your workspace isn't racialized, then that means I come into your workspace and I'm looking like the John Travolta meme, looking for my people, but they're not there. So we'll talk about, you know, as a business, as a service provider, what does marketing and communications look like in an anti-racist framework? We'll also talk about your client and customer engagement. So yes, you can be the superhero anti-racist person that you want to be, but how does that reflect on your customers and your clients? And how do you bring in those customers and clients for either them have an education? Because yes, as a business, as an entrepreneur, you too can do education, but you could also bring in the folks that are not necessarily represented. And then social innovation. So how do we think outside the box when we're talking about anti-racist and business models? Yeah, that's that for now. I know there might be some questions online. And like I said, this presentation was really focused on small businesses. Do ask questions if you are an entrepreneur and you're like, but it's only me. I don't need HR policies because I'm just the one person. We could talk about that too. Okay, we don't have any questions online yet. All right. All right.
Okay. So we don't have any questions online yet. We did have Yukalai and Ishmael shared the link to Northern Voices Rising, their Facebook page, which Paige mentioned earlier. So if you need to find that, it's easy. It's just facebook.com/Northern Voices Rising. And we did get a comment saying, this is from Shelley Taylor, said that was exciting and inspiring.
Thanks, Shelley. You're exciting and inspiring. That's awesome. Shelley is one of the founders, has founded Venus Envy Halifax and Venus Envy Ottawa, which I will be using their example because through Shelley's legacy, Sam Whittle, who works at Venus Envy Ottawa, has also put in practices of anti-racism. So I'll be using that. as well. Thanks for creating an awesome workspace for people like me.
Yeah, so if anyone online has any questions that they'd like to ask or just any more comments, feel free to ask. And anybody in the room, we can throw it out if we've got some time.
Let's do it.
Shelly just added to her last comment saying, I wish I'd taken this course back in 1998.
Oh. That's nice. Yeah, go for it.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
And it's a big one, so I'll defer to you on how we tackle this or handle this. I'm curious to explore a little bit or hear your thoughts on this sort of tension between wanting to engage and ask for input and partner and have local NGOs come and do their thing and so on and so forth, and like really try to hear from the people who are affected by these things, versus placing too much burden on already disadvantaged people, that like, you know, turning to your Black friend or turning to your Indigenous friend and asking them to explain the Black Lives Matter movement and that sort of thing. Or even just like those people whose capacity is already overtapped. So, you know, going to First Nations governments to engage with them on something when we know they don't have enough people capacity or enough time to actually do all of the engagements that they're invited to. So there's a question somewhere in there.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, a lot of times when I do this, you know, people say, I want to be an ally, but I don't want to do it wrong. How do I do it without overburdening people? It's a question that comes up often, and I'm really happy you asked. And sometimes I say, you know, like, yes, it's like, be proactive. There's nothing wrong with sending out an email and saying, hey, I'm a local, what's your business, or what's your, I want to use you as an example.
I'm a life coach, and I'm also here because I work for Yukon University Innovation and Entrepreneurship.
Oh,
so we are in the like entrepreneurial support ecosystem, and trying to spread this message to a lot of the innovators and entrepreneurs that we work with.
Right, legit. So again, you know, there's a difference between, hey, you are a Black person, can you answer all of these questions for white people, right? Like, hey, Paige, we are working, you know, at Yukon University. We're trying to implement this program. We want all the Black people to join. But then moving forward, you don't actually, again, within your workspace, you don't even include Black people on your leadership team. Or Yukon University, just like any other universities, not specifically Yukon, but they are very white spaces, right? So there's a difference between, I want you to be that token person that I can say, we hired one Black person to do this visioning for us, but it's not actually going to be with Black people. And then there's also the, you know, hey, can you lead this? Can we give you this money and you lead the strategic visioning and you bring in the people that you know can do the work. So I think there's different ways of asking and being supportive. Often I think also of requests for proposals. I don't participate in them because A, I'm horrible at writing, B, it's so exhausting and demanding, and C, I'm like, why would I give you my awesome ideas for free? Because then you're profiting off my ideas, but I'm not good enough for you to hire. What does that mean to me and my brilliance and my existence? I say my, but I am talking about Black people and Indigenous people. We are brilliant, we are excellent. And sometimes it's that leap of faith and that understanding that we can do these work that doesn't transpire and doesn't happen. And that's why we have designated group hiring, right? I think, yes, well-meaning means you're gonna make mistakes. And also understand that we are not a monolith, right? Some people will want to do that work. Some Black people are exhausted and they're like, do not talk to me about racism. I deal with it all day, every day. I just want to come in, buy your things, and then peace out. So be specific too, in terms of who you're asking. If you know the person's doing the work, you know, then ask them. If a person is Black and doesn't do any work on anti-racism, equity, whichever, then the intention isn't there to support them and to uplift their work. The intention is for you to look good. I'm not saying you specifically, but in general. And like I said, we're smart. We know the difference between inclusion and tokenizing and tokenized experience. So yeah, I say well-meaning, you're going to make mistakes. You know, some people say, don't talk to me. Some people will be like, absolutely sure. Create that space too. Often you'll hear equity, diversity, inclusion, or sometimes people say diversity and inclusion without equity. And I say diversity is like you went and you got those colors, and that's great. But are those colors actually included in the space? You know, are their needs met? And that might be a question that you ask, like, yes, I'm setting you up for the space and I'm setting you up for success, but what specifically do you need as a Black person, as an Indigenous person, as a person of color, that I can make sure that your needs are met? And then equity, which everybody seems to forget, is that decision making or the power distribution. You know, again, if you're bringing in all the racialized workers, you know, for your business that is, I'm trying to not be too specific without being too giving out what next week's going to be, but let's say you're a catering business, you make food, and so you're like, yeah, we recognize we only hire white people, so you hire racialized people, and you're like, look, we have so many racialized people, and they're included in the cake making. Do those racialized workers only work frontline with a certain salary, or is there room for them to grow into those leadership roles? So again, that equity, diversity, inclusion all comes into play, and be really specific with your intentions. Yeah, does that answer? Yeah.
We have a comment from online, a question from Rebecca World, who says, incredible presentation, thank you. My question is about colonial timelines. Do you have any advice for folks like me who are working with external funds from Canada that come with really strict timelines? Well, I'm trying to do good work with external colleagues who often operate at the speed of trust.
Yeah. Oh, I am now a public service worker, so I cannot talk about Canada. Let's see how long that lasts. But I do love the conversation about timelines, because again, sometimes you want to do all the good work, but you have specific time, right? You have to like do the work till December, and then December you have to say how that work was impactful. And sometimes it is about talking to those funders and be like, there's no way you're going to reach equity and anti-racism within these timelines. It doesn't make sense either, because with the work and the funding that we got, we recognize that this is a bigger situation. And so I guess the second part of that could be, hey, thank you for your money. Give us more money so we could continue that work. But do be honest and do be frank about it, because often people who are funders don't understand the concept of impacts on communities, right? I think for any of us who are in the Yukon, we know this conversation happens, especially with Yukon First Nations, where we're talking about doing work, doing it great, and then leaving a community, and then leaving, you know, the work to be done without the resources to continue and to make sure that that work is viable. We see it often in NGOs, where NGOs will be like, okay, cool, I got that funding. It was very specific. You know, it was about including BIPOC folks, but then another funding comes, and then you let go of all the work and all that support that you did for BIPOC folks because the next flavor of the month has come in. So sometimes it is about talking about being realistic with deadlines, where you will not dismantle white supremacy in a day. If not, we wouldn't have people like Trump. If not, we wouldn't have conversations like this. It takes a lot of time, but recognize that not everybody understand the time and the impacts that these timelines have. So yeah, sometimes it is about being honest and saying, this is what we were able to do within that time frame. Give us more money so we can continue on. And if their intentions are real, they will give you more money, right? If their intentions are legit about including BIPOC folks or being anti-racist or whichever, you know, they will support your work because they'll understand where your intentions are coming from.
Excellent. We have another question from Chelsea and Steve that reads, I'm a small business that doesn't have any employees and may never, but collaborates regularly with other businesses and organizations. Should I have a who I work with policy? And what could that look like?
Yes, yes. I love that question. Of course you should, right? Why would you work with a white supremacist? Like, I don't know. I'm laughing, but legit, right? Like, think about your partnerships and intentions. These are somewhat, I don't want to say new conversations, because I feel like I'm not giving respect to the people who have had these conversations before. So with respect to the OGs, this is somewhat of a new thing in terms of anti-racism. People want to be anti-racist, but yeah, sometimes it does mean doing that sacrifice. And I talked a little bit about power, right? When you're an entrepreneur and you're like on the hustle and the grind and you're like, I want everybody to know us. Well, who are these people that you're bringing in? And if they're racist, you will bring in racist people. It is what it is. And, you know, there are always racialized people, whether you see us or not, especially here in the territory. We need to talk about, you know, people not seeing us for some reason. There will always be people who support you. And sometimes it is making that sacrifice of saying, if you're anti-racist, it's not really a sacrifice, but saying, this is where I stand. If you don't stand there, if you're not with this program, then why would I want to support you? Why would I want to partner with you? Why would I want to be in business with you? Because you're going to bring these people that are going to let go or cast to the sides of people that I'm actually rooting for. So yeah, really good question, Chelsea and Steve. You know, sometimes it is about making those decisions, and best to make that decision now when you're just starting, and to be able to have that flexibility to add on to that decision, right? So right now, you know, we went from racist to anti-racist to anti-Black racist to anti-Indigenous racist to anti-POC racist. Like, the words will change, the definitions will change. Make sure that there's flexibility to bring on more solidarity for other marginalized voices that aren't being talked about right now.
Okay. That's it for the questions online. I'm going to give everyone online just 30 seconds or so to make yourselves known if you have another question to ask. After that, we're going to have a 5-minute break in person here. And then if you have more questions to ask Paige, then we'll all come back here and we can have a in-depth conversation.
Yeah. And I think while people are maybe potentially writing online, for folks who may have missed this, it will be available on UConstruct's YouTube page. I'm saying that with a question mark, but I'm asking.
It will be available online, either YouTube or Facebook, one of those.
Either YouTube or Facebook. So, and another way you could be anti-racist is if you are working with a partner who is pretty racist or who says all lives matter, maybe take on this video and share it with them, and, you know, have the conversation. I know Friendsgiving, I don't call it Thanksgiving, but Friendsgiving is coming up, and maybe you have a racist Uncle Bob. Share this presentation with your racist Uncle Bob. Have these conversations. I'm saying this with a smile, but yes, it is that work that needs to happen, because then it takes off that burden of us racialized people to always have to explain our existence and the importance of our existence, but B, it's also your contribution, whether it's big or small or monetary or not, to hold on to combating racism. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Paige.
Thank you.
So that's it for part 1. I'm going to remind everyone that part 2 happens next week. So go online, either Facebook or Eventbrite, and make sure that you register so that you don't miss it. And hopefully we'll see all of you next week.
Yay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.